Coming up on this episode of the All Aboard Podcast, we continue our journey aboard luxury trains, now of the 80s, 90s, and today. Have your incredibly expensive tickets out of that envelope. All aboard, please. Now boarding on track number 8 is train number 1, the All Aboard Podcast, your twice weekly excursion into transportation excellence. And I am your conductor, Phil Bell, Enterprise B, PB Crisp, Mr. 645, a highly trained rail enthusiast who hopes to one day become a highly trained broadcast specialist, and I am blessed to hold the E. Hunter Harrison Chair here at the Bell Institute for Advanced Railroad Studies, where there are no degrees, because the learning never ceases. And for the second time this week, it is great to be back behind this, the Brunswick Green PLB microphone. Now, as a little recap, in the last episode, we talked about luxury trains, but we talked about those from the earlier portions of the 20th century. And that was the Empire Builder, the California Zephyr, the Broadway Limited, and the 20th Century Limited. But in the 1980s, you saw a very big resurgence in interest in rail. Now, a lot of that had to do with the fact that railroads had cleaned up a lot of the problems they had in the 1960s and the 1970s. You saw the privatization of Conrail. You saw Amtrak start to hit its stride and begin under Graham Claytor to provide a very uniform product for the most part. And so therefore, you also had a lot of entrepreneurs who got in the business and rediscovered rail and said, well, hey, maybe we can make a dollar here or there. So a lot of what you saw, in fact, probably the most ubiquitous was, of course, the dinner train. And in a future episode, we will cover dinner trains. But you also saw a lot of luxury trains. And as somebody who was riding the rails in that era, I got to see up close the first train that we're going to talk about, and that is the American European Express. Now, in 1990, the American European Express started its operation. And initially, it was a set of very beautiful, luxurious rail cars that were attached to the end of Amtrak's Capital Limited. And so where I ended up seeing this when I was riding the train with my grandmother, we were going from Tallahassee, Florida, where we spent most, or I should say half of the time, which is when I was in school, up to New Jersey, Hackensack, where most of my family lived. So Christmases, summers, you name it, we would make this trip. And of course, because I am a big agitator and was a highly trained rail enthusiast, even then, I wanted to take the train. So we would take the Silver Star, which was my preferred train. And when we'd come into Washington, D.C., starting in 1990, we saw the American European Express. And now I want you to think about for a second what Amtrak looked like in those days. You had the Phase 3, which has become famous yet again for how beautiful it was, scheme that was painted on all of their equipment, but quite frankly, in practice, it was very dingy. And that's because then as now, Amtrak was not exactly the best at keeping equipment clean. But then when the Silver Star pulled into Washington Union Station, we would look across the platform because that's where the Capital Limited was always parked, because Amtrak marketed a transfer from the Silver Star to the Capital Limited because of the fact they had discontinued the Floridian, which operated from Chicago to Florida, in a way to accommodate the remaining people who were going from the Midwest to the Southeast. And on the back of it were these beautiful cars that looked so clean that you could practically eat off of them. So let me get you an example of what that looked like for those of you who are watching us on CP5 Cam. Now, this video is by Tom Gears, who is a very well-known rail enthusiast who's worked with a variety of short lines and rail organizations and so forth out there. And let's make sure I did a very good job of getting this queued up. However, as you know, the number one thing that we are known for here at the All Aboard Podcast, besides our rail knowledge, is when things don't go well. But here you go on the video. This is Amtrak's Capital Limited arriving at Harper's Ferry, West Virginia in 1990. You can see, even though the resolution is not great, you've got a couple of F40PHs right here on the head end. And as the Capital Limited was known for, right behind those F40PHs was quite a bit of head-end traffic that Amtrak then carried on both the Capital Limited and the Broadway Limited. Now, as we get a little bit further down in the video and the train is departing from Harper's Ferry, you will see that, number one, the train carried a dome car which is something that we can't exactly imagine Amtrak carrying these days, although they did. The single-level domes were used on the Capital Limited as well as the Lakeshore Limited, the primary East Coast trains that had them. It had Heritage Fleet diner and sleepers, as you are seeing in this view here, but also, so the sleeper former Santa Fe Pine Series 10 and 6, but after those, you then see the beautiful cars of the American European Express, which were always kept so clean. As I said, it felt like you could practically eat off of them. What's also interesting on this edition of the AEE, and it looks like they want to show us an ad right in the middle of our view of the train, so we'll let that go. At the end of that version of the AEE was a former sleeper, Bud fluted sleeper, that was converted to an observation, and this was before they obtained probably their centerpiece, which was the former New York Central Sandy Creek. But anyway, let's get back to a little bit of the history of it. So it was the brainchild of a man named William F. Spann, and Bill, as he is better known, was a serial entrepreneur, and he got his start in Richland County, South Carolina, as the chief legislative assistant for that county's delegation to the state legislature, and that will play a little bit of a role later. He became the managing partner of the Bay Point Yacht Club in Panama City, Florida, and he also ran Jack Nicklaus Eyewear from 1980 to 1983. But he ended up working with a man named Albie Glatt of Nostalgia Orient Express, which ran one of the luxury spin-offs of the original Orient Express in Europe. And so, as a side note, the original Orient Express, and that is the famous train that ran from Paris to Istanbul, operated until 2009, interestingly enough, as a non-luxury train running between Strasbourg and Vienna. And it was gradually cut back from that original route. And since then, there have been a variety of companies that have jumped in to provide some form of Orient Express experience. So Nostalgia Orient Express was one. The one that we are very well acquainted with is the Venice Simplon Orient Express, which was started by an American entrepreneur. And recently, there was another Orient Express that was launched by Accor Hotels, and they are going to be operating on a portion of the route as well. And what I find so interesting about that is Accor Hotels, for a very long time, owned both the Red Roof Inn and Motel 6, so I think it's pretty funny that we are looking to pay ultra luxury prices to the exact same company that ran Motel 6 during the Tom Bodett era, for those of you who remember him as being the pitchman for Motel 6. And so that just tells you the extent to which, whether we're talking about extreme luxury that you might find on a train, such as an Orient Express, to something that is much, much lower end, how in a lot of cases those end up being managed and offered by the same company. So that's an interesting insight into the business world overall. But in the 1980s, AEE, the American European Express, refurbished 10 rail cars, and they divided them into two sets of 5, and they put these cars on the rear of the Capital Limited initially from Washington to Chicago. So they had interesting names. So the Berlin was a former Union Pacific 11 double-bedroom sleeper, Placid Lake, Pullman Standard from 1956. Chicago, a former Union Pacific lunch counter diner, St. Louis car in 1959. Monte Carlo, Baltimore and Ohio 10 and 6 sleeper, Opequan, that was built by Pullman Standard in 1950, also being used as sleeper. Of course, we've mentioned the former New York Central Sandy Creek, which was the famous, one of the two famous tail cars that were built for the 1948 and unfortunately final version of the 20th Century Limited. And thankfully, the Sandy Creek still exists, and actually just saw it a couple of weeks ago on Norfolk Southern's OCS train. It's owned by former NS chairman Wick Moorman, and so you will see it from time to time when Mr. Moorman is out on the rails. But that was the last car on the American European Express after its renovation was completed. They had the Paris, a former SP 442 sleeper, one of two that were used there in 1950 for Pullman Standard, and also the St. Moritz, which was an Alpine View, a 14-section sleeper that I believe was built for the Union Pacific by American Car and Foundry in 1954. Most notably, it was known for having a grand piano there, one of two cars that did so. So that gives you an idea of the type of luxury that was created. What was so noteworthy about this, though, is that aside from the Sandy Creek, none of these cars, and I do mean none of these cars, would ever be even remotely considered to be luxurious in their Class 1 common carrier railroad service. So 14 section sleepers, that was the kind of thing, open sections, those were the least desirable sleeping accommodations outside of a coach that were offered in the pre-Amtrak era. 11 double bedroom sleepers, those were great, but it wasn't exactly luxurious accommodations. 10 and 6 sleepers, the most common sleeping car type offered during the Streamliner era. So that gives you an idea. And of course, a lunch counter diner, just think about a lunch counter, but on rails. These are not exactly luxurious. So what Cast and Rail Car and Northern Rail Car were able to do with these cars and turn them into these absolute rolling works of art is truly amazing. And another thing to note is that all of the cars were built by either Pullman, American Car and Foundry, or the St. Louis Car Company. Now, I do not have an exact reason as to why that is. None of the literature has explained that, and none of the information that I've been able to find through some personal conversations have indicated it. However, my best guess is that Bud, for the most part, sold cars that were stainless steel and fluted, and that required they needed to be etched in order to hold paint, because you couldn't just exactly spray paint on the stainless steel sides. The other cars were built generally with carbon steel, and then in some cases they were built with fluting that was attached to the underlying carbon steel. Now that would end up producing a problem later on for a lot of cars, because it would end up through, I believe it was some kind of electrical, what's the best word for it, causing electrical current between the two different types of steel would end up eroding parts of the car body itself. And that is one of the reasons why you don't see as many Pullman built cars in existence today, because frankly, they rotted due to this. And so it's noteworthy that American European Express picked these cars only for their service, but it's probably because they were smooth-sided, and that gave the best effect to look a lot like the like the Orient Express, for which they were patterned after. Now, the first run was on November 15th, 1989, and the patronage was very low. At first, they operated daily, so anytime you saw the Capital Limited, you saw American European Express. And I do remember reading in Trains magazine that they had to pay a little bit of a charge for an extra locomotive to be added to the train, because their cars added additional weight to it. And you also have to think about that's actually pretty reasonable, because going over the Baltimore and Ohio, in Maryland and West Virginia, as well as Pennsylvania. And so what we're talking about is the Keystone subdivision primarily, as well as the I want to call it the Brunswick, the Metropolitan subdivision. These are very up and down routes, and they have extensive grades, especially when you get on the Keystone subdivision going out over Sandpatch Mountain in Pennsylvania. So the Capital Limited, already being a heavy train at the time, with its complement of Amfleet 2s and also streamlined passenger cars, plus the Mail and Express that would be there, that was the reason why you were going to need more power to get over the hill. And let's also remember at the time what kind of locomotives were pulling it. As you saw a few minutes ago, it was the EMD F40PH, each of which had 3,000 horsepower. However, you also have to remember that at least 700 of that horsepower was debited from the amount, because one of the two locomotives was always providing the head-end power that was needed, and that required using an extra generator that was attached to the drive shaft of the locomotive's engines, prime movers. So that took power away from traction. So that's why they would need to pay extra for that additional locomotive. Now, patronage was low, as I said, and by May of 1990, they cut that back to tri-weekly. So the other 2 times per week, however, they would put the cars on the back of the Broadway Limited. So that enabled them to serve New York, in addition to serving Washington, D.C. Now, this worked pretty well I shouldn't say pretty well. It worked for a while, but as you can tell, if patronage was low, they needed to make a change. And I also want to stress one of the reasons why patronage was low, that's because it wasn't exactly inexpensive. So for one person to ride in a bedroom from Washington to Chicago, it would set you back $695 in 1989 prices. And then if there was 2 of you, you and the lovely Mrs. whomever, it would be $1,042.50. Amtrak, by contrast, would only charge you $434 for double occupancy in a bedroom, so you and your companion would be able to do that. And that, however, was, of course, your heritage sleepers with updated versions of the traditional accommodations that had become so accustomed to the railroad traveling public. Now, there was a big change that took place, but before we get to that, I want to show you a little bit about what the American European Express looked like inside, because, one of the things that really set this apart was how luxurious that the train could be. And so this is actually from a man named Chuck Weinstock, who took a trip aboard the American European Express during a positioning move, because the train was moved from the Atlanta and St. Andrews Bay Railroad, where it was stored, better known as the Bay Line, up to the Northeast, where it could operate. And so there you see a couple of the Bay Line's Jeep 38s pulling the American European Express consist. But after some pictures of the individuals, here you see what it was like aboard the train. Very sumptuous couches, great seats in the dining car. Look at the deep wood paneling. These interiors were designed by Melissa Spann, who is the wife of Bill Spann, the founder of the American European Express. And then as we scroll down here, you see to the right, Mr. Spann here sitting at the table in a club car with one of the individuals. And there's one more of people having very nice looking drinks aboard one of the cars. And finally, again, more couches, and gives you an idea of what it looked like. That would give you just some idea of why somebody might be interested in paying over $500 in order to get on a train. Now, it was originally targeted at the business traveler, and the idea was, well, if you are so high level and you're wealthy enough to be traveling in first class air, and let's remember, most business travelers who are doing that are doing it on a business account, and they probably have the weight at work to say, look, what I want to do is travel first class, and you can't tell me not to, because most people who travel for work even now are barred from doing so on the company dime, using first class. But that was the original target. And of course, that didn't work because there weren't enough people who were willing to do that. Had they been successful in doing so, it would have been very much a throwback to the way things were during the era of the 20th Century Limited and Broadway Limited that we talked about in the last episode, when, of course, you saw a lot more of the passengers doing that. Now, what was the big change that I alluded to a few moments ago? Well, that comes to us in the form of a little place that you probably heard of called the Greenbrier. And the Greenbrier, of course, was for many years owned by the Chesapeake and Ohio Railway and then its successor, CSX. In fact, a funny story that comes from Hayes Watkins, who was a longtime CEO of the Chesapeake and Ohio and one of the founders of CSX, about the Greenbrier comes from the fact that it was to be the alternate location for our government, the House, the Senate, and the President, to meet in the event there was a nuclear attack or some form of major devastation to Washington, D.C. And so there was an underground bunker that nobody knew about except the Chesapeake and Ohio, and then not everybody at the Chesapeake and Ohio. That bunker, which is now available for you to view and tour, is where our government would have met had something crazy gone on. And of course, the government had to pay the Chesapeake and Ohio for this privilege of keeping the bunker there. And the story goes that the checks were sent directly to Mr. Watkins himself, the CEO of the railroad, who would deposit them, and he would handle all of this on his own. The chief financial officers and otherwise did not know about this. Well, eventually, when Chessie merged with Seaboard to create CSX, the first chief financial officer came from the Seaboard. And when this was all declassified, which wasn't that long into the early CSX era, the CFO is reading the paper and he sees this story about how the government had an underground bunker at this property that was part of his company and he was responsible for the money for, except of course technically he wasn't. And that's how he found out, and he was very embarrassed. And Hayes Watkins, of course, he goes in and, goes very upset about that he was not read in on this. But that was the funny story, that the CFO finds out in the newspaper that the federal government is paying his company, the Chesapeake and Ohio Railway, now CSX, to put an underground bunker. And by the way, the bunker is not small. at the Greenbrier Hotel. But why are we mentioning the Greenbrier in reference to the American European Express? Well, that's because the American European Express needed someplace to go. So they switched to serving the Greenbrier because this is a great tourist destination. And this very much fit with what the American European Express was. So on March 1st, 1991, they began operating between New York and Chicago on the route of the Cardinal. And that is, for the most part, the same route that the Cardinal takes today. And it meant that man ran on the Northeast Corridor, or as we like to call it, the main line New York to Philadelphia and main line Philadelphia to Washington, between New York and Washington, D.C. Then it got on Norfolk Southern's Piedmont Division, which CSX had operating rights over for a period of 99 years into the early 2000s, from Alexandria, Virginia to Orange. Now, of course, between Washington and Alexandria, this was the end of operated over Conrail between Washington and Arlington, and the RF&P from Arlington to Alexandria. I always like to remind people that a segment of that is actually Conrail track, and that the RF&P, of course, handled the trains of the Southern as well as the C&O to get into Washington, D.C., not to mention the Baltimore and Ohio to get to Potomac Yard, which, of course, now no longer exists, but was in Arlington and Alexandria, Virginia. And you can see a lot of the interesting shopping centers and areas, including a place called Notch 8, in an ode to what used to be there. Once the train got to Orange, Virginia, it got onto CSX's former Chesapeake and Ohio, which took it down to Gordonsville, Charlottesville, and then White Sulphur Springs, where the Greenbrier is located. And even today, you can take the train to the Greenbrier, located right across the street from the White Sulphur Springs, West Virginia train station. Here is a more modern view of what things look like. That's a P-42 pulling the Cardinal to a stop at the White Sulphur Springs station, and it does look very nice, and literally the Greenbrier is a short walk across the street. And that's actually where my attempted involvement in this came in, because in recent years the Greenbrier was sold by CSX to Jim Justice, who is now governor of West Virginia. But before he became governor and he was running the Greenbrier along with his other properties, he wanted to have a train that would go from Washington, D.C. to the Greenbrier in White Sulphur Springs. And so he started working with Ross Rowland, who is the owner of C&O 614, to have his locomotive lead the train, and he would actually lead the process of putting it together. Now, it got to be a struggle because CSX at the time was pretty much unwilling to permit this, and I'm surfing the internet, I'm trawling for opportunities because, as you know, I wanted to get into the railroad business myself. So I decided to reach out and said, hey, you know, I think I could make something happen, because I had some contacts in the rail industry. And Mr. Justice was gracious enough to allow me to meet with him at the Greenbrier. We had a great conversation, and he told me to actually go talk to Ross Rowland. And that inspired one of my favorite rail fan adventures, which is where I met Ross Rowland in New Hope, Pennsylvania, when he was a guest engineer on the New Hope and Ivyland. And I got to ride in the cab with him Christmas of 2012, just before Christmas of 2012, as he was running New Hope and Ivyland number 40. And I'm sitting in the fireman's side while the fireman stood up. He let me sit there in his seat while he shoveled coal, because it's a hand-fired steam engine. And I'm waving out the window on the passenger side, acting like I actually do something. Sorry, the fireman's side, acting like I actually do something. And people are waving back at me like I mattered. And it was a lot of fun. Unfortunately, it did not result in anything, because I was not able to raise the money that I needed to do in order to make that happen. But it was a great experience. And in the process, I also had a chance to have a phone call with Bill Spann himself. Very gracious gentleman. I won't get into too much of what we talked about, because I haven't, asked him if I could share the details of that. But rest assured, this is somebody who truly did understand what it took to build this kind of a service, which at the time was very much revolutionary and was definitely along the lines of people looking over and saying, it certainly can't be done. And for a brief time, he did pull it off. So he and Eugene Garfield are both in what I would call the pantheon of railroad entrepreneurs. Now, as the train got onto this route to the Greenbrier, and it went from the Greenbrier to Chicago over CSX, B&O, and Conrail, including a couple of portions of the rail system that you probably won't ride today, the South Chicago and Southern's Bernice Cutoff, which has long since been pulled up, and a portion of the Peoria and Eastern. Now Amtrak follows a different route, which is very circuitous. To get the Cardinal from Dyer, Indiana, into Chicago Union Station is responsible for a lot of the delays that train, the Cardinal, typically has. But what they did in order to make this happen is, first of all, they worked with CSX to provide crews for the train. And that meant a variety of interesting things that took place. The first was what you see here was leasing a couple of GP40s from National Railway Equipment. So that is AEE or NREX number 1, which is a Jeep 40 of B&O ancestry. There was a second one of Kansas City Southern ancestry. They also, for a brief time, used CSX's famous 4 F units, and you see 3 of the 4 here, led by former Clinchfield number 200. That railroad's only FP7. And you'll also notice that back there in the consist is a MARC, Maryland Area Railroad Commuter, F9PH, and you can see it a little bit better here. That was one of the locomotives that they used to provide head-end power as they started to operate to the Greenbrier, because the GP40s did not have the ability to provide that. They were simply freight locomotives that were being used in passenger service. And number 2, the AEE, during its first iteration on the back of the Capital Limited and the Broadway Limited, had no need for head-end power since it was being provided by Amtrak's locomotives. So that was one of the big changes that they made doing this. And so the service actually was quite successful, operating to and from the Greenbrier, and this was a big benefit to both AEE as well as CSX. Unfortunately, it didn't last very long, because on June 21st, 1991, the train hit a truck that was on the tracks in Monon, Indiana, on the former Chicago, Indianapolis, and Louisville, and this caused a substantial amount of damage to some of the cars. There were very minor injuries, which is good. Unfortunately, apparently some investors were on board, and this really shook them up. And so they were getting back in. They had to refund a substantial amount of fares, which was reported by some of the railroad press, and I believe it's Train Magazine, at $1 million. But they plan to continue that service, and they did for a while, and then they were going to have a seasonal service that would have operated between New York and Miami called the Grand Floridian. But there was another accident, and this unfortunately took place on the Northeast Corridor. There were a couple of trespassers that got hit during one of the trips that were for investors and prospective passengers and travel agents and so forth. And so this is kind of what let things fizzle, and that brought an end to the American European Express. Now, it did, as I said, show a lot in that this concept very much could work. Unfortunately, it did have a little bit of a difficult end, but that was not the end of the story, because, as of course many of you know, the American European Express consist ended up becoming part of the American Orient Express, which toured America for just about 2 decades in a variety of forms. It had several different owners, ranging from Henry Hillman, who was a famous what's called Pittsburgh industrialist, not venture capitalist, but industrialist, because he did invest in a variety of industries and helped them grow. Also Tom Rader of Rader Railcar, TCS Expeditions, and that train was very successful for several years. Eventually, it was sold to Phil Anschutz, who planned to use it on a different service, did not, and then it ended up being broken up. Now, again, back to my experience, part of this consist was sold to Jim Justice and the Greenbrier, and so those cars would have been used on my resurrection, or had I worked with Ross Rowland or otherwise on that service, but currently those are continuing to move around the country. One last note on the AEE. If you're watching this on CP5 Cam, you'll notice our thumbnail, the Sleeper Berlin, is actually in the thumbnail. It was on the back of Amtrak's, I believe, Silver Meteor one day that I had traveled on it, and I got a picture of it as it was pulling away at the Alexandria station. So let's move on briefly to our second train that we want to talk about, and that is the Rocky Mountaineer. And we're talking about the Rocky Mountaineer because it has become not only what has been said a symbol of Canada and Canada's economic power, but it's also a symbol of private sector entrepreneurship. Now, the Rocky Mountaineer, however, has its origins in Via Rail Canada. So in 1988, it began as a weekly, daytime-only service from Vancouver operating to both Calgary and Jasper, and was called the Canadian Rockies by Daylight. And the idea actually came from a private sector entrepreneur who was operating a travel company at the time and a Canadian national locomotive engineer. Now, just like today's Rocky Mountaineer, it was a daytime-only service and it was focused on sightseeing. So the majority of this operation was over Canadian Pacific's main line, and so they would park at Kamloops overnight. And this is something that is still done today on all the Rocky Mountaineer services. So they don't offer sleeping car services, unlike, of course, the American European Express did. In 1989, it was renamed the Rocky Mountaineer, and that is a name that has stuck. And ridership then increased to 15,000 people. So only in daytime service, and that was a 59% increase over 1988. But there was one problem. As you know, we've discussed in our conversation about Via Rail Canada a few years ago, Via was running massive deficits, and I believe in each of those years they lost about $50+ million, $55 million one year, $57 million the other. That's for company wide, not just for the Rocky Mountaineer service on its own. So that's what led to the effort to rationalize the system. And so there is a link in the description to an annual report from that period, which shows how much the service was cut back, but also tells the story of the Rocky Mountaineer, or Canadian Rockies by Daylight, and how it grew. However, unlike a lot of the other services that were just cut and said goodbye to, and in many cases have never come back, Via decided that they wanted to sell this service to the private sector. And so the purchaser ended up being Peter Armstrong. He is now and still the head of the Rocky Mountaineer. And of course, he was benefited in 1990 because the cuts took the Canadian, which was the famous overnight train that served this area. And we're talking about areas such as Banff, Kamloops, you name it, these very majestic tourist areas in the Canadian Rockies that have continued to thrive despite the absence of common carrier passenger rail service, and saw the Canadian itself, where the name Canadian used on a train that operates quite a bit further north on the Canadian National Main Line, where the scenery is nice but is nowhere near as majestic. So in 1990, they began operating and continued to expand. They took over some of the former Whistler North Wind services that were operated by the British Columbia Railway when it was taken over by Canadian National, and it has continued to grow. Most recently, though, in 2021, they introduced a U.S. route from Denver to Moab, Utah, and that is probably the most interesting because just following the pattern that they have in Canada, where they work with the freight railroad as opposed to the passenger railroad, they work with the Union Pacific. And in fact, some of the early trains were pulled by Union Pacific SD70Ms, which actually had a logo for the Rocky Mountaineer put on the nose in place of the Union Pacific shield and wings that were on the wide cab locomotives at the time. So as things go now, the Rocky Mountaineer has only continued to grow and remains a trip that I am hoping to take and share with you on this podcast. Now, we are going to cover a lot more of these luxury trains in the future because, quite frankly, they really do merit coverage, and I would certainly much rather cover them from aboard the train than just here behind the Brunswick Green PLB microphone. So what I want you to do is like, share, subscribe, and tell others about this podcast. And get ready, because next week we will be back with some great topics, but you're going to have to find out what they are. And one more thing, please, as always, make sure to join us and follow us on Patreon. Become a robber baron. That will help keep this show on the rails. So we will see you down the main line, and I hope you have a great day.